State and local governments are practically the last refuge for defined benefit pension plans. But shortfalls in those funds are stressing many states and all their residents already reeling from the bad economy. Joining us, two men deeply involved in pension challenges in their states. From San Francisco, David Crane, Special Advisor to California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger on jobs and economic growth. And from Madison, David Stella, Secretary of Wisconsin's Department of Employee Trust Funds. Welcome to you both.
Good morning.
Thank you, Sheila. Good morning.
Secretary Stella, Wisconsin has one of the healthiest pension plans. Why is that? What are you doing right? More conservative, less generous?
Both of those, actually. I would attribute it to four reasons. One, we have a very strong and independent governance model for our pension plan. Secondly, we have exercised funding discipline over many years. Thirdly, we have a relatively modest benefit structure. And fourth, we have a risk and reward feature in our plan that requires employers and employees and retirees to share the risk and reward of investment return experience in the plan.
I want to ask you more about risk and reward later, but let me ask David Crane. Earlier in the show, we heard Governor Schwarzenegger say that there has been a tech bubble, housing bubble, and now he says there's a pension bubble that is about to burst. Is your pension system about to tank?
Yes, and it's for the four reasons that David just mentioned. For Wisconsin, California has them in exactly the opposite place. We do not have an independence governance system. We have not adequately funded pension promises when those promises are made. We have conflicts of interest, and all this has been known for a long time, and the net result is we have built up an enormous amount of debt in California in the form of pension promises that are unfunded.
David Crane, how much does health promises to pay the health costs of retirees play into this?
They're a completely separate item that are also unfunded. So for example, in California, we have roughly $500 billion worth of unfunded liability for pensions, and we have another $120 billion worth of unfunded liabilities for retiree health care.
And Secretary Stella, are health promises a factor in Wisconsin's situation also?
Sheila, if you looked at the Pew report on Wisconsin, we were rated as a solid performer both in pension and in funding of pensions and health promises. It does not represent anywhere near the health insurance promises don't represent anywhere near the problem that has been identified in California.
David Crane, you have talked passionately about the need for pension reform. In simplest terms, what do you mean by reform?
Well, it takes the following forms. Reform in California and virtually everywhere, the situation is the same except for places like Wisconsin who have done a better job. It means adequately funding promises when they're made. It means having an independent board of directors at our state pension funds that represent the interests of the people that are actually on the hook, which means the taxpayers. And it means not masking the issuance of debt. These pension promises that have been made, the amount of debt that is effectively issued by those pension promises has been understated for decades now by our pension funds.
So, Mr. Crane, how do you address all that?
Well, first you need to reduce benefits for new employees. We can't address the benefits for existing employees. Those are already promised, they're contractual, and those will be paid. But for new employees, you can reduce the level of those back to the level they were, for example, before our legislature raised them in 1999. You can enforce strict contribution requirements when the promises are made. You can require adequate reporting of the debt that's being issued in that regard. You know, for example, our pension funds right now are behaving the way Lehman and AIG did by not properly reporting the amount of the pension promises that are being made. And you can end the conflicts of interest at the boards of directors of our state pension funds by requiring independent directors that are responsive to the citizenry rather than to special interests.
Secretary Stella, let me ask you about this, because as well run as the Wisconsin Fund is, there's a conservative free market think tank, the Wisconsin Policy Research Institute, which has essentially called for reductions in benefits to public employees in Wisconsin, critical at least to that degree. Are they right about pension benefits in Wisconsin being too generous?
As you may know, Sheila, I took issue with that report because I think there was a comparison made between public and private sector pension benefits, and we believe that that study actually skewed the results in a way that was unfair. We, in fact, believe that our benefits not only are adequate, but they, in fact, are sustainable, and as I said earlier, they are fairly modest. And so we would take issue with that. I think the larger issue here really isn't one just of public pensions, but of pension security and adequacy for all Americans. I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. If you look at private sector pensions across the country, there is a looming problem there as well. More than half of employees, non-public employees, in other words, private sector employees, aren't covered by pension plans. And of those that are, most are covered by 401k plans, which have their own funding issues that are now coming to light at this time.
Yeah, I'm very glad you raised that. Let me ask Mr. Crane about that, the perspective that we should have. Does it you mentioned, for example, some reductions in benefits. Does it look to us as if benefits to public employees are too high, or is that just because we're so accustomed to benefits shrinking for private sector employees?
No, you really have to look at this issue not in a vacuum. It all fits together as a puzzle. So, for example, the level of the benefits is a problem if you don't properly fund those benefits at the time that those promises are made. That's been the biggest problem with public pensions, which is this sort of underreporting of their cost and therefore the underfunding. To put it in perspective, our pension funds in California, when the promises are made to employees, contribute just 60% of the amount that Warren Buffett would contribute for the exact same promise under one of his defined benefit plans. And the deficiency that results from underfunding up front, that underfunding, by the way, is contributed by both the employee and the employer. 100% of the deficiency is picked up by the government. So the problem is not just the size of the benefits, but the underfunding. But let me go back to something that everybody needs to understand. The public pension problem, the consequences of underfunding there and extravagant promises, if people want to consider them that, those consequences fall on other public programs that people care about. So, for example, in California, while we've seen the cost of pensions rise 2,000% over the last 10 years, we've seen funding for higher education, which serves 670,000 students on 33 campuses in California, actually decline. So that the amount that we're paying now for retirement benefits in California is greater than the amount that we are providing to the University of California and to California State University. So the consequences here are reductions in spending for higher education, reductions in spending for health and human services, environmental protection, parks and recreation, all of those sorts of things. That's what people need to consider here. This is not like something where the consequences fall on the beneficiaries of these pensions. They don't. They fall on these other programs.
Secretary Stella, what kind of adjustments do you expect Wisconsin to have to make? Mr. Crane was telling us about the impact that coming up with money in California is going to have. Is Wisconsin already seeing impacts like that in keeping its pension so well funded?
Yes, we are, Sheila, and let me give you some examples. For the last 2 years, we have actually been reducing retiree pensions by modest amounts because of the risk-reward sharing feature that I spoke about earlier. The risk-reward sharing feature essentially does not guarantee any cost of living adjustments to our members. So if we grant them in the past, we can actually take them away when the financial experience of the system declines. And for the last 2 years, we have reduced pensions, and we may in fact have to do that next year as well. The second feature that we have is a risk-sharing arrangement between employees and employers in terms of contribution rates. We actually share contribution rate increases equally between employees and employers, And who pays those contributions are part of a collective bargaining agreement or compensation plan agreements between those employees and employers. So we have sort of automatic limiters, as it were, to adjust for changing economic circumstances.
Mr. Crane, Doug Elliott told us earlier that states are generally far too optimistic in what they think their investments in the trust funds are going to actually return. What kind of assumptions is California using in deciding?
Mr. Elliott's comments are an understatement. The assumptions that public pension funds have made and continue to make are fantastical. So, for example, in 1999, California's pension funds were effectively forecasting, implicitly forecasting, that the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which was then at about 11,500, was going to be at 25,000 by 2009 and 28 million by 2099. Even now, our public pension funds are assuming that the Dow Jones is going to double every 10 years and keep on doubling forever.
Let me ask Secretary Stella what it's like in Wisconsin. What is your outlook for the market?
Our outlooks for the markets, first of all, are based on a very, very long-term look forward, and we use an assumption, a return assumption of 7.8% currently, although that can be adjusted upward or downward depending on our view of the markets over the very long term. Now, we believe 7.8 currently is a reasonable assumption going forward, and we have essentially sought advice from a number of consultants, expert consultants, who agree with that assumption. I think we also have to look backward a bit and realize that for the last 25 years, the return of public pension plans, investment return of public pension plans, has averaged over 9.25%. Over the last 20 years in Wisconsin, our return has averaged more than 8.5%.
If I may, let me address what David has just said. That 7.8% per annum return assumption is effectively forecasting the market to double every 10 years. These consultants who advise these pension funds that these returns are adequate very often have conflicts of interest. They're paid by the pension funds. They hope to earn future fees from those pension funds. And 100% of the bill of these overestimated returns is picked up by innocent parties down the road who get lower funding from state budgets. So we have to enforce low investment return assumptions in these pension funds to protect the future.
Mr. Crane, I just have to ask you, we don't have much time, but what's the political reality of anyone picking up on the recommendations that you're making?
You know, I think that there's a very good chance that this is going to happen this year. I'm a Democrat. My fellow Democrats in the state legislature who have long been opposed to pension reform are seeing the consequences of not having pension reform being cuts to the programs they care about. You cannot both be a progressive and be opposed to pension reform.
Secretary Stella, quick last word.
Well, it is not like we have not been challenged by the financial meltdown over the last 2 years. And we do have our issues. But as I said before, our adjustments are being made over a very long time, and they're already in place to, in effect, adjust to the changing financial